Every morning, he packed 2 lunches, never 3. No one noticed the empty seat at his own table. They thought he didn't care. They never once asked why his hands shook every morning. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself a lot of things. He collapsed on the factory floor. What the doctors found next would change everything his family believed about him. They never knew he went hungry every night. Now, they will never let him go hungry again.
If you have ever loved someone so much that you would rather starve than let them see you struggle, this story is for you. Before we begin, take a second to hit like and subscribe, because stories like this one deserve to be seen, and there are more waiting for you. Now, sit back, because what you are about to hear is the kind of story that will make you look at the quiet, tired man in your own life a little differently. Daniel Reyes had a rule he never broke. His children would never go to bed hungry, not once, not ever, no matter what it cost him. He had made that promise on the night his wife Elena died, kneeling beside her hospital bed with their daughter Mia asleep in his lap and their son Sam barely 3 years old, too young to understand why his mother's hand had gone cold. Daniel did not remember making the promise out loud. He only remembered that when the nurse asked if he needed anything, he said no, because saying yes felt like admitting he needed anything at all, and admitting that felt like defeat. 5 years later, Daniel was 38 years old, though the lines on his face suggested a man closer to 50. He worked the early shift at Halden Manufacturing, a metal stamping plant on the edge of town, arriving before sunrise and leaving after the light had already started to fade in winter. His hands were rough, scarred faintly along the knuckles from years of handling sheet metal, and his back ached in a way that had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. He lived with Mia, now 10, and Sam, now 8, in a small rented house with a leaning porch and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of instant coffee. The town itself, Millbrook, was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did, which was often worse. It was the kind of place with one main street, a diner that had been open since before Daniel was born, and a school where the same 3 families had sat on the PTA board for a decade. News, gossip, and casseroles traveled at roughly the same speed, and Daniel, whether he liked it or not, had become a fixture of a certain kind of quiet local narrative, the widower who kept to himself, the man everyone had opinions about but no one had actually asked. To the outside world, Daniel looked like a man who had checked out. He rarely smiled at school pickup. He answered questions from teachers in short, clipped sentences. He missed the spring parent evening because his shift ran long, and he missed the winter one because the car wouldn't start. The other parents at Lincoln Elementary had their own theory about Daniel Reyes, that he was cold, distant, maybe even a little neglectful, a man who had let grief turn him into someone who simply didn't try anymore. Mia heard the whispers. She was old enough now to understand what people meant when they lowered their voices and said, "That poor family," with a look that wasn't really pity. It was judgment dressed up as concern. What none of them knew, what not even his own children knew, was that Daniel Reyes had not eaten a full dinner in over a year. It started small, a missed lunch here, a skipped breakfast there, always with some excuse ready if anyone asked, though no one ever did. The numbers simply did not work. Rent had gone up twice in 18 months. The car needed a transmission repair he could not avoid. Sam had grown out of 2 pairs of shoes in 1 school year, and growing boys did not care about municipal cost of living statistics. Mia had started asking to join the school's art program, which required a supply fee Daniel would sooner have set himself on fire than let her miss. So he did the math the way he always did. Rent, utilities, gas, groceries for 2 children who deserved real meals, shoes, art fees, the small emergency fund he refused to let drop below $200 because a man without a cushion was 1 flat tire away from disaster. And when the math didn't work, which was most months, Daniel simply subtracted himself from the equation. He became an expert at performing fullness. He would cook Mia and Sam's favorite meals, chicken and rice, spaghetti with turkey meatballs, pancakes on Sundays, and he would fill their plates generously while serving himself what looked like a normal portion but was, more often than not, mostly vegetables and water, or sometimes nothing at all, just a mug of black coffee he called "already ate at work." He told them he'd had a big lunch. He told them factory food was heavy and he wasn't that hungry. He told them so many small protective lies that he sometimes lost track of which ones he'd already used that week. The hardest nights were the ones when Sam, who noticed more than a 7-year-old should, would push his plate toward his father and say, "Dad, you can have some of mine. I'm not that hungry either." Daniel would laugh it off, ruffle his son's hair, and insist he was full, all while his stomach twisted so tightly it felt like a fist closing around itself. He would wait until the kids were asleep, and then he would drink water until the hunger dulled into something he could sleep through, or he wouldn't, and he would lie awake counting the hours until his alarm told him it was time to go stand on a factory floor for 10 hours anyway. On the mornings before school, Daniel's routine ran with the precision of a man who had removed every unnecessary motion from his day because he could not afford to waste a single one. He was up at 5, packing lunches before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, cutting Sam's sandwich into triangles because Sam insisted triangles tasted better than squares, checking that Mia's homework folder was zipped, that both children's shoes were by the door, that the thermostat was low enough to save money, but not so low that the house felt unkind. He drove them to school himself whenever his shift allowed it, and on the mornings it didn't. Mrs. Alvarez walked them the 4 blocks, waving at Daniel's tail lights as he pulled away toward the plant with a travel mug of coffee that was, more often than he would ever admit, the only thing in his stomach until dinner. He thought about Elena more in those quiet morning minutes than at any other time of day. She had been the one who hummed while making breakfast, who somehow made a Tuesday feel like an occasion. She had been sick for 11 months before she died, a diagnosis that arrived almost gently and then refused to leave. And in that time, Daniel had learned what it meant to watch someone he loved disappear by inches while still showing up, every day, with a smile for 2 small children who did not yet understand what disappearing meant. He had promised her, near the end, that the kids would never feel what he felt watching her fade. The cold, specific fear of not having enough, not enough time, not enough strength, not enough anything. He had decided somewhere in that hospital room that if there was ever a shortage in his house again, it would land on him first, always, and it would land on him alone. Daniel's sister-in-law, Carol, Elena's older sister, had never approved of him. She had never said it outright, not in those words, but Daniel had felt it in every visit, every clipped comment about the state of the house, every raised eyebrow at Sam's slightly too small jacket or Mia's scuffed sneakers. Carol lived 2 towns over in a house with a 2-car garage and a husband who worked in finance, and she had built, in the years since Elena's death, a quiet narrative in her own mind that Daniel was not equipped to raise 2 children alone. She loved Mia and Sam fiercely, that much was true, and that love had slowly curdled into something else, a conviction that she could do it better. It came to a head on a Sunday afternoon in early autumn. Carol had shown up unannounced, as she sometimes did, ostensibly to drop off a bag of hand-me-down clothes from her own kids, but really, Daniel suspected, to inspect. She found the refrigerator nearly empty except for milk, eggs, and a single block of cheese. She found Sam's shoes with a hole starting at the toe. She found Mia, when asked how school was going, mention offhandedly that she hadn't been able to join the art program because Dad said maybe next semester. Carol did not raise her voice. She simply sat Daniel down at his own kitchen table and told him, in the calm, devastating tone of someone who believes she is being reasonable, that she had spoken to a family law attorney, that she was concerned about the children's welfare, or that maybe, just maybe, it would be better for everyone, especially Mia and Sam, if they came to live with her and her husband for a while. Just until you get back on your feet, Daniel. I'm not trying to hurt you, I'm trying to help them. Daniel sat very still. He did not shout, though something in his chest roared. He thought of every meal he had skipped, every double shift he had picked up so Sam could have new shoes before the school photo. Every night he had sat outside Mia's door listening to make sure the nightmares about her mother had passed before he let himself sleep. He thought about how none of that would show up on paper, how a lawyer would only see a thin bank account and a thinner refrigerator, and how a judge might look at those 2 facts and see exactly the story Carol was telling. "You don't know what I've given up," Daniel said quietly. It was the closest he ever came to telling her the truth. "Then show me," Carol said, "because right now all I see is 2 kids who are falling behind and a man who has stopped trying." He didn't show her. Pride, exhaustion, and something like shame kept the words locked behind his teeth. She left that day with the hand-me-down still in the trunk of her car, and a promise, delivered gently but unmistakably, that she would be filing paperwork with the court within the month if things did not improve. The days that followed felt to Daniel like walking on a floor that might give way at any moment. At school, Mia had overheard two classmates repeating something their own mother had said at pickup, something about that Reyes girl, and how someone really ought to do something. Mia did not fully understand what do something meant, but she understood the tone, the way children always understand tone, even when they miss the words. And she came home that day quieter than usual, picking at her dinner instead of finishing it, until Daniel finally coaxed out of her what had happened. He had knelt down in the kitchen, held her face in his rough hands, and told her the only thing he could think to say that wasn't a lie. "There is nothing wrong with this family, Mia, nothing." He said it with more conviction than he felt, because underneath the words was the terrifying possibility that a lawyer, a judge, a system built to read bank statements instead of bedtime stories, might actually agree with the whispers. He called his own mother that night, long after the kids were asleep, the first time he had asked anyone for advice in years. She listened quietly and then said the thing mothers say when they have nothing practical to offer but refuse to offer nothing at all. "You are doing exactly what a father is supposed to do, Daniel. The world just doesn't always know how to see it." It did not fix anything, but it was enough to get him through one more night. For the first time since Elena died, Daniel allowed himself, alone in his truck in the driveway, to cry. The weeks that followed were the hardest of his life, harder even than the funeral, harder than the first Christmas without Elena. He picked up every extra shift Halden Manufacturing would give him, arriving at 4 in the morning and not returning until well after the children were in bed, leaving them in the care of Mrs. Alvarez next door, a retired school teacher, who refused to accept payment and instead simply said, "You're a good father, Daniel. Don't let anyone tell you different." He started skipping not just dinner but breakfast too, telling himself the overtime pay would cover the art fee, the new shoes, a little cushion in the account that a lawyer might actually respect. It was on a Thursday in late October that Daniel's body finally gave out. He was on the factory floor, guiding a sheet of steel through the stamping press, when the edges of his vision began to soften and blur, the fluorescent lights overhead smearing into long white streaks. His co-worker, a broad-shouldered man named Terrence who had worked beside Daniel for 6 years, would later say that Daniel simply folded, like a puppet with the strings cut, collapsing against the machine housing before sliding to the concrete floor. Terrence had known Daniel for 6 years, ever since they'd been paired together on the same line during Terrence's first week at Halden Manufacturing. Terrence had a loud laugh and an even louder loyalty, the kind of man who remembered everyone's kids' names and birthdays without writing them down. He had watched Daniel decline slowly over the past year, the way you watch a friend decline when you're too polite or too afraid to say something directly, the loosening collar, the excuses about already eating, the way Daniel's hands had started to tremble slightly by the end of a shift. Terrence had asked him twice, gently, if everything was all right, and both times Daniel had waved him off with a joke about factory food in a busy household. Terrence hadn't pushed, a decision he would spend the following weeks regretting, quietly, in the way good friends regret not pushing harder when it mattered. He came to in the break room, propped against a stack of folded tarps, with Terrence kneeling over him and the plant safety officer already on the phone with emergency services. "Danny, man, when did you last eat?" Terrence asked, his voice tight with a fear that had nothing to do with workplace liability and everything to do with genuine friendship. Daniel, dazed, muttered something about being fine, about just needing a minute, but his hands were shaking too badly to hide it, and the paramedic who arrived 12 minutes later took one look at his blood sugar reading and did not bother pretending it was nothing. At the hospital, the diagnosis was blunt and clinical: severe malnutrition, dangerously low blood sugar, dehydration, exhaustion consistent with someone who had been systematically depriving himself of food for an extended period. The doctor, a woman in her 50s with kind, tired eyes of her own, asked Daniel directly, "Mr. Reyes, are you struggling to afford food?" And Daniel, lying in a hospital bed for the second time in his life with his children's faces flashing behind his eyes, finally broke. He told her everything: the rent increases, the transmission repair, Sam's shoes, Mia's art fees, the quiet arithmetic he performed every single day, subtracting himself from the equation so the numbers would work for his children. He told her about Carol, about the lawyer, about the fear that had been sitting in his stomach for weeks, heavier than any hunger. Terrence had come to the hospital too, sitting in the waiting room long after his shift ended, and it was Terrence who, without asking Daniel's permission, called the school to let them know why Mia and Sam's father hadn't picked them up. And it was Terrence who, in a moment of protective anger, he would later say he didn't regret for a second, posted something on the town's community Facebook page. He didn't frame it as gossip. He framed it as truth. He wrote about the man he'd worked beside for 6 years, the man who never complained, who always covered a shift for a coworker with a sick kid, who had just collapsed on the factory floor because he had been starving himself so his own children could eat, have shoes, take an art class. He didn't ask for money. He asked people to simply see Daniel Reyes for who he actually was. The post did not go viral in the way loud, dramatic things go viral. It spread the way true things spread in a small town, quietly, from one person to another, gathering weight instead of noise. Mrs. Alvarez saw it and cried at her kitchen table. Mia's art teacher saw it and immediately waived the supply fee, calling it a scholarship instead of charity, because she understood that Mia would need to keep her dignity intact. The owner of the local grocery store saw it and quietly set up a running account in Daniel's name, one he would not be permitted to argue about. And Carol, scrolling through her phone on an ordinary Tuesday evening, saw it too. She read it 3 times. She read about the missed meals disguised as a big lunch at work. She read about the double shifts taken not for greed, but for a boy's shoes and a girl's paintbrushes. She read the words, "He never once let his kids know he was hungry." And something in her, some certainty she had built her whole understanding of Daniel around, cracked wide open. She drove to the hospital that same night. She sat in the hallway outside Daniel's room for nearly 20 minutes before she found the courage to go in, and when she finally did, she found him sitting up in bed, pale but stable, a hospital tray of food, actual food, untouched on the table beside him because his hands were still trembling too much to hold the fork steadily. "Why didn't you tell me?" Carol asked, and her voice for the first time in years held no judgment at all. "Because you would have thought less of me," Daniel said honestly. "You already thought I couldn't do this. I wasn't going to hand you proof." "Daniel," Carol said, sitting down heavily in the chair beside his bed, "I have never in my life seen proof of love like this. I was so busy looking at what you didn't have that I never once asked what you were giving up to make sure they did." She picked up the fork from his tray and, without asking, began helping him eat, the way you might help a child or a soldier returning from something no one else could fully understand. She did not mention the lawyer again. She never filed the paperwork. Instead, in the weeks that followed, she became something she had never been before in Daniel's life, an ally. She started showing up not to inspect, but to help, bringing groceries without making it a production, sitting with Sam over his homework, taking Mia to her first art class herself, sitting in the back of the room with tears in her eyes, as she watched her niece paint with a joy that had been quietly, invisibly, paid for. Mia and Sam learned the truth slowly, the way children learn the biggest things, in pieces, through overheard conversations and gentle, careful explanations from their father once he was strong enough to have them. Sam cried first, burying his face in Daniel's hospital gown and saying, "You should have told me, Dad. I would have shared everything, always." Mia, older and quieter, simply held her father's hand and said nothing for a long time, and then finally, "I thought you didn't care enough to come to my school stuff. I never thought it was because you cared too much about everything else." Daniel came home from the hospital 11 days later, ordered by his doctor to eat 3 real meals a day without exception, a rule he found almost funny given how carefully he had built his entire life around the opposite. Terrence and a handful of co-workers had, in his absence, quietly repaired the leaning porch step Daniel had been meaning to fix for 2 years. The grocery store account remained open, no questions asked, for the following 6 months, until Daniel insisted, with the same stubborn pride that had nearly cost him everything, on paying it forward instead, sponsoring another family at the store whose situation he recognized in a way few others could. In the months that followed, Daniel found himself, almost against his will, becoming someone people leaned on rather than someone people whispered about. Terrence started a small informal tradition at the plant, a shared lunch table on Fridays where workers pooled whatever extra food they had, ostensibly for anyone who forgot a lunch, though everyone understood its real purpose. No one ever singled Daniel out. That, he would later say, was the kindest part of all of it. He was never made to feel like a cause, only like a colleague who mattered. Mia's teacher, a soft-spoken woman named Ms. Whitfield, who had quietly waived the art supply fee, made a point of telling Daniel, at every pickup afterward, one specific thing Mia had done well that day, a small ritual that cost her nothing and gave Daniel, who had spent years believing he was failing at every school interaction, a reason to walk away, standing a little taller. Sam, for his part, started saving half of his own snack every day at school, insisting to his teacher that it was for later, though everyone eventually understood it was a small, fierce 8-year-old's way of making sure no one in his family ever went without again, even if it meant carrying a slightly squished granola bar in his backpack for no reason at all. He did not become a different man overnight. He still worked hard, still carried the quiet weight of raising 2 children alone in a world that too often mistook exhaustion for indifference. But something had shifted permanently in how he let himself be seen. He started answering teachers honestly instead of curtly. He let Mrs. Alvarez bring over a casserole without insisting he didn't need it. He let Carol help, and in doing so discovered that being helped was not the same thing as being weak, a lesson that took him nearly 40 years and 1 hospital bed to finally learn. A year later, Lincoln Elementary held its annual spring art show, and Mia's painting hung in the center of the display wall. A simple image of a kitchen table with 2 full plates and 1 empty one, and above it, in careful 10-year-old handwriting, a title that made every adult in the room fall silent. What my dad gave up so we wouldn't have to. Daniel stood in front of it for a long time, Sam's hand in his, Carol standing quietly beside him with tears she didn't bother hiding, and for the first time in 5 years he let himself believe fully and without reservation that his children had always known exactly how much he loved them, even when he thought he was hiding it. 2 years after the collapse on the factory floor, Daniel stood at the edge of the same school gymnasium where Carol had once threatened, in that quiet kitchen conversation, to take his children away, watching Sam receive a citizenship award for, among other things, organizing a small food drive in his class for families who might need a little extra, no judging, just helping, a phrase the 10-year-old had clearly borrowed, almost word for word, from his father. Mia, 13 now and taller than her mother had ever been, sat beside Carol in the front row, the 2 of them sharing a private joke Daniel couldn't hear, and he found that he no longer felt the old flicker of resentment when he saw them close like that. Carol had earned her place in that row, slowly, patiently, through 100 small acts of showing up that had nothing to do with inspection and everything to do with love. The whispers around town changed too, the way whispers do when the truth finally catches up to the rumor. The parents who once called him distant now called him one of the strongest men they knew. The teachers who once worried quietly about his children now held him up gently as an example of a love that asked for nothing and gave everything. Daniel never wanted the attention, and he never fully got comfortable with it, but he stopped flinching from it, because he understood now that hiding his sacrifice had never protected his children. It had only ever protected his pride. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you, it is this. The people who seem the coldest, the most distant, the most checked out, are sometimes carrying the heaviest, quietest weight of all. And they are carrying it precisely because they love too much to let you see them struggle. Look a little closer at the tired father in the school parking lot. Look a little closer at the parent who never seems to have time, who never seems to smile, who seems on the surface like they simply don't care. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes they care so much it is quietly, invisibly starving them, and all they need, all they have ever needed, is for someone to finally ask and truly listen to the answer. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house once a family has weathered something like this together. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of ease. The kind where nobody needs to fill every gap in conversation because the love in the room speaks plainly enough on its own. That was the quiet Daniel found most evenings now, sitting at his kitchen table with 2 full plates in front of Mia and Sam, and finally 1 full plate in front of himself. No more mugs of black coffee standing in for dinner. No more careful lies about big lunches at work. Some nights Carol joined them, bringing a dish of something homemade, and other nights it was just the 3 of them, and either way the table felt, for the first time in a long time, like enough. Daniel Reyes never went hungry again after that October, but more importantly, he never again let silence be the price of his children's dignity. And in the end, that quiet, invisible sacrifice became the loudest, most enduring lesson he ever gave them, that love, real love, does not need to be seen to be real, but it deserves, always, to finally be known.